One of the biggest sort of philosophical or ideological battles that's happening right now within the left, and even to some degree within the progressive left, is about the approach to making change. How do you get change to happen? And we can sort of roughly, coarsely sum up the two positions by saying fix the system or burn the system down and create a new one once you've burnt down the system that we have. Now, it's an oversimplification. It's how we are oversimplifying today in order to have this discussion. There's more nuance to it than that. But in a large sense, this is it. Do you believe the system works well enough that you would try to make changes to it? Or do you believe that the system is so broken that it has to first fail or be destroyed before real change can be made? Now, from day one, when we talked about, for example, about two candidates, neither of whom ended up being the Democratic nominee, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, we talked about how on policy, they end up in pretty similar places on a lot of issues, but their approaches are very different. Bernie came from the 70s hippie, further left revolution mentality and was kind of pulled towards moderation in terms of a lot of his policy over time. Warren came from the opposite place. Warren came from a much more centrist or even center right position and eventually was pulled to the left, where her policies ended up being similar to Bernie in many ways. But she is in the mindset of fix the system, work within the system, make changes to the system. Today, I want to talk only about what has worked in the history of the United States. So this is not an analysis of any candidate. This is not a moral judgment about any candidate. This is not an analysis of any particular policy that we're looking at. It is only historically which approach has worked for achieving change that moved the country to the left, working within the system, or burn it down, build it back up, more of a revolutionary style approach. We can call it whatever you want. None of these are pejoratives. I think we sort of understand what we're talking about here. And it certainly links more to the ideology, more of the Bernie Sanders supporter in the context of the Democratic primary. Now, as I've said before, the paradigm that has brought us the most progressive change in history is making changes to the system that we have rather than revolution and burning it down. Now, that being said, there have been times when the type of burn it down change that some want has happened, but I am going to make the case today that those big revolutionary moments have come after horrible events, what I would call cataclysm, that includes endless death. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So let's start by looking at the successes. There are three major eras of progressive leftward advancement in the United States that we can look at. We can look at the progressive era of the 1890s to the 1920s. We can look at the New Deal era between 1933 and 1939, and exactly how you define these eras, there's some leeway. And then the civil rights era of the mid-1950s to roughly 1965. So let's look at each of these and see which category they fall into. The progressive era at the turn of the 20th century was catalyzed by activism and demand for social reform. Going through every achievement of the progressive era would be sort of difficult, impractical, but the reforms of the progressive era dealt with corruption, dealt with labor and labor rights, dealt with antitrust, with women's voting, of course, expanding labor policy and labor unions, a whole bunch of bureaucratic stuff that was really important, including things like municipal reform. And it was all catalyzed by the idea of we've got to build up the middle class, and economically that will be good. Morally, it's the right thing to do. And we've got to put in some safety net elements for the poor. It all happened by tweaking the system. Now, the thing is, progress can seem slow when you're in it. And in fact, this was a 30-year period. That's a long time. Now, from 2020, it's easy to look back and say, wow, look at all that stuff that they accomplished so quickly. But 30 years is a long time, and I encourage you to look at the full list of accomplishments. When you're in the middle of big change, 30 years seems very, very slow. Looking back, though, we realize, even though it was done by community activism, by slowly getting a more favorable Supreme Court, it led to major change. Now, let me give you an example of that. A lot of the progressive era reforms were upheld at the Supreme Court because of Justice Charles Evan Hughes joining with Oliver Wendell Holmes. Okay. Herbert Hoover nominated Charles Evan Hughes. Teddy Roosevelt nominated Oliver Wendell Holmes. So when we say, would Trump or Biden select a better replacement for Ruth Bader Ginsburg and would it matter? Just look at how much this stuff matters. Look at who got to pick Supreme Court justices that led to progressive era reforms. And it was all tweaks, tweaks, tweaks. And over 30 years, it transformed the country. That's example number one. Let's look at example number two of fix the system rather than tear it down. The New Deal era of the 1930s under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This came out of the Great Depression. It included changes that now are considered to be part of the fabric of the country, like the Social Security Administration, but they were not burn it down revolution type changes. It was regulate the banking industry by putting the right regulators in place, create programs to support farmers and the unemployed, support young people and elderly folks. Creating Social Security, you don't get that by burning down the system. They got it by taking more control of the system, regulating securities trading, the Housing Act of 1937, building labor power on top of the changes of the progressive era. It wasn't burn it down. It was not revolution. It was 6 to 7 years of changes from a center-left president. Now, I'll go even further. This is important when it comes to the New Deal era. The New Deal era was so much not a revolutionary phase that there were people at the time saying FDR is not even center left. He's a centrist, and the New Deal is merely a smokescreen to reinforce capitalism as a system. That's how much not of a revolution the New Deal was. Although, of course, I don't buy into that cynical interpretation. And important change happened over a 7-year period. Third, the Civil Rights era. The Civil Rights era was filled with protests and sit-ins and rallies, and a ton of the day-to-day elements that we often today recognize would likely be needed in order to achieve more change and achieve it more quickly. But look at the process. 1954, you got the Brown v. Board of Education decision. That was an early moment in the Civil Rights era, and it was a decision made, again, by the Supreme Court, reinforcing the importance of who gets to pick those justices. That continues to be a theme here. 1956, the NAACP works within the judiciary to win desegregation of the bus system. 1957, Martin Luther King creates the SCLC to support local protest movements and achieve change at the local level. In North Carolina, we had the drugstore sit-in in 1960, which sparked a bigger era of sit-ins to continue making small changes legally in the judiciary at the local, state, and national level. In 63, you get the March on Washington. It demands jobs. It's a new fight against discrimination, which was demanding change from the government, not trying to take it down and cause a revolution. Ultimately, this led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, was that the end? Was that the be-all, end-all of fighting against racial discrimination? No, we're still in that process today. But the point is, the great eras of progress were not burn it down moments. Last thing I want to mention here, when there have been these bigger burn it down type moments of radical, fast change, they've typically been very bloody and came out of cataclysm. Example, the Civil War. The Civil War went from 1861 to 1865. If in 1855, right, about 5 years before the Civil War, you had said, you know, in 6 years, the country will almost be torn apart over the issue of slavery. A multi-year war will ensue during which more than 600,000 people will die. We will just barely be held together, but big change will come of it. We all, of course, would welcome the end result, which is slavery is no longer allowed. But when you look at when things move more quickly in the more revolutionary way, there is endless death and destruction. And to think about causing it deliberately is questionable. And it took, you know, when you look at Reconstruction, 12 years in the United States because of the Civil War, It achieved a great victory, no question about it. It also brought incredible cataclysm to the United States. And sometimes it is the only way. That's what's really important. And of course, the North, the Union fighting in the Civil War, of course they were on the right side. And of course the right outcome came from it. But what history tells us is that if we want to expand healthcare, increase social reforms, regulate industry, the victories have come not from the cataclysm of the type that the Civil War sort of checks a box under. It's come from the reform of the progressive era, the New Deal era, the civil rights era, and the like. Tell me where I'm wrong. This is my perspective. I welcome other perspectives respectfully and with peace and love. I'm on Twitter at @dpakman. I want to hear from you. Quick break, back after this. If you love feeding your intellectual curiosity, but you're always struggling to find the time, check out one of my all-time favorite apps called Blinkist. Blinkist lets you consume an entire book on your way home from work. They take thousands of popular nonfiction books, condense each one into text or audio that you can get through in just 15 minutes, and you get all of the important core ideas and information from that book. It's perfect if you don't have enough time to do all the reading you want to do, or if you just want to sample a book before you buy the entire thing. I recently read A Brief History of Time, of course, by the great Stephen Hawking. This is a book that I have been aware of for so long, and other things got in the way, and it was fantastic to check it out on Blinkist. Blinkist has books on politics, philosophy, science. They have 27 different nonfiction categories, and a subscription is only about $8 a month, and you get the entire library. But you can try it totally free and get 25% off a subscription when you go to Blinkist.com/Pakman. I've put the link right underneath this video.